In the winter of 1997, an 8-year-old boy named Danny Morrison vanished from his family's farmhouse in rural Pennsylvania. There were no broken windows, no footprints in the snow, no ransom notes or frantic phone calls in the middle of the night. The police searched every room, every closet, every shadowed corner of that old house. They found nothing, just emptiness and the cold echo of a family torn apart by a question that had no answer. Where did Danny go? But there was one thing the investigators noted in their reports, something they dismissed as irrelevant, a mechanical quirk of an aging house. The furnace in the basement had begun making unusual sounds. Not the typical clank and rattle of old pipes, but something softer, more rhythmic, almost like breathing. The family mentioned it once during questioning, but the detectives waved it away. Old houses make noise. That's what they do. 28 years later, Danny's sister Sarah just received a letter that would drag her back to that farmhouse, back to that basement, and back to a truth so impossible that even now, as I tell you this story, you might not believe it. Because what Sarah found behind the furnace wall wasn't just the answer to her brother's disappearance. It was something far older, far stranger, and far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. The wall was breathing, and behind it, something was waiting. Something that remembered. Before we go any further, I need you to do something. Subscribe to Ultimate Crime Stories right now, because what you're about to hear has been buried for nearly 3 decades. Some stories aren't meant to stay hidden. Some truths claw their way back to the surface, no matter how deep you bury them. And this is one of those stories. Now, let me take you back to where it all began. Sarah Morrison hadn't spoken to her mother in almost 7 years. It wasn't anger that kept them apart, not really. It was something deeper, something that sat between them like a wall neither of them knew how to climb. Grief has a way of doing that. It builds barriers between the people who should be closest, transforms love into silence, and turns a family into a collection of strangers who once knew each other's names. So when the letter arrived on a cold Thursday morning in January, tucked between a credit card offer and a grocery store flyer, Sarah almost threw it away without opening it. The envelope was yellowed, unsealed, as if someone had opened it once and then closed it again out of guilt or fear or something else entirely. There was no return address, just her name, written in handwriting that made her stomach turn cold. Sarah Morrison. She sat down at her kitchen table in her small apartment in Philadelphia, the morning light pressing pale and thin through the blinds. Her coffee had gone cold in its mug. The city hummed distantly outside her window, but inside her apartment, everything had gone very, very still. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of line paper, folded once. No date, no greeting, just 4 words written in that same unsettling handwriting. He's still there, behind the furnace. Below that, a single letter, M. Sarah's hands began to shake. She read the words again, and then again, as if repetition might change their meaning, might transform them into something less impossible, less terrifying. But the words remained the same, stark and simple and utterly impossible to ignore. He's still there. Her first instinct was to tear the letter into pieces and throw it away. Her second was to call her sister, Jessica, who lived in Portland now and rarely talked about the past. Her third instinct, the one that won, was to stand up and walk to the hallway closet where she kept a cardboard box she hadn't opened in over a decade. The box was labeled in faded marker, 1997 photos. Don't open. But Sarah opened it. Inside were newspaper clippings, their edges brown with age. Police flyers with her brother's face printed on them in grainy black and white. Danny Morrison, age 8. Last seen June 15, 1997. Brown hair, blue eyes, wearing a red Superman t-shirt and blue jeans. If you have any information, please contact the Chester County Police Department. She remembered that shirt. Danny had worn it so often that the colors had started to fade, the Superman emblem cracking and peeling at the edges. He'd loved that shirt more than anything, had refused to take it off even for family photos. Their mother had finally given up trying to make him wear something nicer. Sarah pulled out a photograph from the bottom of the box. It showed the farmhouse as it had looked back then, before grief had hollowed it out, before her father had died and her mother had stopped answering the phone. The house in the photo looked warm, lived in, loved. There were curtains in the windows and flowers in the boxes beneath them. Her father's truck was parked in the gravel driveway, and if you looked closely, you could see a small figure in one of the upstairs windows. Danny, probably, watching the world from his bedroom, making up stories about the clouds. The farmhouse had been searched, of course. Searched so thoroughly that the police had taken up floorboards and broken through walls. They'd brought in dogs that sniffed every corner, every shadow. They'd examined the woods behind the property, dragged the creek that ran along the western edge of the land. They'd questioned everyone, family and neighbors and strangers, who'd happened to be passing through Chester County that June. And they'd found nothing. Nothing except a basement utility room that the police couldn't access. The door had been warped shut by a winter flood, swollen and jammed so tightly that it would have taken a crowbar and considerable effort to open. The investigators noted it in their reports, but ultimately decided there was no way Danny could have gotten inside. The door was sealed from the outside. There were no other entrances. The room was effectively inaccessible. So they moved on. But Sarah remembered something the police reports didn't mention, something she'd never told anyone, not the detectives, not her therapist, not even Jessica. She remembered the sounds that used to come from behind that basement door in the weeks before Danny disappeared. Not the clank of pipes or the rumble of the furnace turning on. Something else. Something that sounded like whispering, like scratching, like something breathing in the dark. She'd been 11 years old then, old enough to know the difference between imagination and reality, but young enough to doubt herself. She'd mentioned it once to her mother, who'd smiled and said old houses make strange noises, sweetheart. Don't worry about it. And so Sarah had buried it, pushed it down into the same place she pushed all her fears, and tried to forget. But now, holding this letter, reading these four impossible words, she couldn't forget anymore. Sarah pulled her phone from her pocket. The contact was still there, though she hadn't used it in years. Mom. Her finger hovered over the name for a long moment before she pressed it. The line rang once, twice, then a click, and a voice she barely recognized, thinner and more fragile than she remembered. Sarah. Sarah froze. Hearing her mother's voice unlocked something inside her she hadn't expected. Not anger. Not even sadness. Fear. You got one too, didn't you? Sarah asked quietly. Her mother was silent for a long moment. Then, barely a whisper. Yes. This morning. Did you call anyone? No. Why not? Her mother's voice faltered, broke slightly, then steadied itself. Because I think it's time. Sarah stared down at the letter in her hand, at those four words that had dragged her out of 7 years of carefully constructed distance. I'm coming home, she said. And before her mother could respond, before Sarah could change her mind, she ended the call. The drive north felt like moving backward through time. Sarah's hands gripped the steering wheel as she passed exits she hadn't seen in years, landmarks she tried to forget. The billboard for Henderson's dairy farm, long since closed and covered in rust. The turnoff for Lake Pearson, where she and Danny used to fish with their father on Sunday mornings. The old iron bridge that crossed Miller's Creek, its paint peeling and faded. Each mile stripped away another layer of the life she'd built in Philadelphia. The life where she was just Sarah Morrison, 36 years old, working in marketing, living in a studio apartment with plants she kept forgetting to water. With each passing mile, that Sarah grew fainter, and in her place emerged someone she tried very hard not to be. The girl in the back seat of her father's station wagon, sitting next to her little brother, counting fence posts and making up songs with no words. She remembered those car rides. Danny had loved to hum, would create elaborate melodies with his mouth closed, his feet kicking against the back of the passenger seat. Their father would tell him to stop kicking, but Danny never could. He had too much energy, too much life in him. He couldn't sit still, not even for a moment. The summer he disappeared, the car rides had stopped. After that, there was no music, no counting, no games. Just silence and the sound of their mother crying when she thought no one could hear. The farmhouse appeared over the rise exactly as Sarah remembered it, and yet completely different. The gravel driveway was choked with weeds now, frost creeping up through the cracks. The mailbox hung by a single rusted screw, the name Morrison barely visible beneath layers of weather and time. The windows, once filled with light and white lace curtains, were empty now, dark rectangles against the weathered gray wood of the house. Sarah pulled up slowly, her tires crunching over frozen gravel. She turned off the engine and sat in the silence. No birds, no wind, just the vast, empty quiet of a place that had stopped living a long time ago. The front door opened before Sarah could knock. Her mother stood framed in the doorway, smaller than Sarah remembered, wrapped in a pale cardigan that looked 2 sizes too big. Her hair, once dark brown like Sarah's, was streaked with silver now. There were lines around her mouth that hadn't been there before, shadows under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and questions that had no answers. They stared at each other for a long moment. 2 women, separated by 7 years and 28 winters. Finally, her mother stepped back. "Come in," she said softly. "I kept the heat running, just in case." Sarah crossed the threshold and stepped into the past. The house hadn't changed much. The same braided rug in the entryway, worn thin in the center from decades of footsteps. The same grandfather clock in the hallway, its hands frozen at 3:17, the time it had stopped working back in 2003, and no one had ever bothered to fix it. A faint scent hung in the air, cedar and old coffee, and something vaguely metallic that Sarah couldn't quite place. And there, on the hallway wall in a cheap plastic frame, was Danny's school photo from 2nd grade. The same gap-toothed smile. The same cowlick in his hair that their mother had tried and failed to smooth down that morning. The same blue eyes that looked directly at the camera, with absolute trust in the world and everyone in it. Sarah stopped in front of the photo, unable to move, unable to breathe. "He would have turned 36 this year," her mother said quietly behind her. Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak. In the kitchen, her mother poured tea, as if no time had passed at all, as if they'd just seen each other yesterday. They sat across from each other at the same wooden table where Danny had once built towers out of sugar cubes, where their father had read the newspaper every morning, where their family had shared countless meals before everything fell apart. Sarah finally reached into her coat and slid the letter across the table. Her mother stared at it, but didn't touch it. "I burned mine," she said softly, "but I memorized it first." "Do you think it's real?" Sarah asked. Her mother didn't answer. She stared into her tea, as if reading something in the steam, some message written in heat and vapor. "You know what the police said," she finally murmured. "They said the furnace room was inaccessible. That Danny likely wandered off into the woods. That we should prepare ourselves for the worst." Sarah's hands clenched around her mug. "But he didn't wander off." "No," her mother agreed, her voice barely a whisper. "He didn't." They sat in silence for a long moment. Then her mother spoke again, her voice distant, as if she were speaking from very far away. "Do you remember how Danny was afraid of the basement?" Sarah remembered. Danny had hated going down there, would cry if the basement door was left open too wide. He'd told them once that something lived behind the furnace, a whispering shadow that knew his name. Everyone had thought he was just being imaginative, that he'd watched too many scary movies or heard too many ghost stories. But Sarah had heard it too. Once. Late at night, when she couldn't sleep, she'd crept downstairs for a glass of water and heard it. A soft sound, almost like breathing, coming from behind the basement door. She'd stood there in the dark kitchen, frozen, listening. And for just a moment, she could have sworn she heard her name whispered in the darkness. She'd never told anyone, had convinced herself it was just the house settling, just the wind, just her imagination playing tricks. But now, sitting in this kitchen 28 years later, she wondered if it had been something else entirely. "Someone wants us to look again," Sarah said finally. Her mother nodded slowly, her eyes distant. Someone. Or something. That night, after her mother had gone to bed, Sarah stood at the top of the basement stairs. Her hand rested on the doorknob, and for a long moment she couldn't make herself turn it. Beyond this door was the past, was the question that had haunted her family for nearly 3 decades, was the answer she both desperately wanted and desperately feared. She took a breath and opened the door. Cold air spilled up from the darkness below, carrying with it the scent of concrete and mildew and something else, something warm and organic that didn't belong. Sarah clicked on the light switch. A bare bulb flickered to life, casting weak yellow light down the wooden stairs. Each step creaked under her weight, the sound too loud in the heavy silence. The basement looked exactly as she remembered it. Cardboard boxes stacked against the walls. Old paint cans. A row of dusty Christmas decorations that hadn't been used in decades. Shadows pooled in the corners, thick and undisturbed. And there, in the back corner, was the furnace room door. Still closed. Still chained. Still warped and swollen, as if the house itself had grown around it, sealing it shut. Sarah approached slowly, her footsteps careful on the concrete floor. The door looked ancient in the dim light, the wood dark and water-stained. The chain across it rusted and brittle. And there, just above the handle, was something that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. A smudge. Small. Child-sized. A fingerprint. Fresh. Sarah reached out with a trembling hand and touched the door. It was warm. Not the ambient warmth of a running furnace, but something else. Something that seemed to pulse gently under her palm like a heartbeat. She pulled her hand back as if burned and stumbled backward, her heart hammering in her chest. From somewhere deep in the house, she heard a sound. Soft. Rhythmic. Like breathing. And for just a moment, she could have sworn she heard a voice, faint and far away, calling her name. The next morning brought snow. Not much, just a light dusting that frosted the fence posts and coated the porch railing in white. Sarah stood at the kitchen window, coffee in hand, watching it fall in slow spirals. Her mother was still upstairs, either asleep or avoiding her. Sarah couldn't blame her either way. At 9:30, someone knocked on the front door. The sound startled Sarah. The farmhouse was far off the main road, isolated enough that unexpected visitors were rare, especially in winter. She set down her coffee and walked to the front door, opening it cautiously. An older man stood on the porch, maybe 70, wearing a tan work jacket and a faded Phillies cap. His breath curled in the cold air. His eyes were kind but sharp, the eyes of someone who noticed things. "Sarah Morrison?" he asked. "Yes." He smiled faintly. "Probably don't remember me. I'm Walter Bennett. Used to live up on Ridge Road. Your dad and I played baseball together in high school. I helped board up some windows here after everything." Sarah stared at him for a moment. Then the memory clicked into place. Walter. The neighbor who used to bring them tomatoes from his garden every summer. The man who'd plowed their driveway before the county snow trucks came through. The one who'd called Danny Dano and taught him how to throw a curveball. "I remember you," she said. "He used to call Danny your star pitcher." Walter's smile grew sad. He had a good arm. Would have been something if he'd had the chance. They stood in silence for a moment. Then Walter cleared his throat. "Saw your car in the driveway last night. Figured you came back for a reason." Sarah hesitated, then opened the door wider. "You want coffee?" They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Sarah had shown her mother the letter. Sarah slid the yellowed paper across to Walter. He didn't touch it, just read it where it lay, his expression unchanging. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair and folded his arms across his chest. "I'll be honest with you, Sarah," he said. "I always thought there was something wrong with that basement." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. "What do you mean? You ever hear a house breathe?" Walter asked. Sarah frowned. "Breathe." Walter nodded slowly. "I used to help your dad with the furnace maintenance every fall, right before the first freeze. And there was something about that utility room that never sat right with me. It was always too warm, even when the heat was off. And when you stood by the back wall." He paused. It felt hollow, like there was space behind it. Sarah's fingers tightened around her coffee mug. "Hollow. Like there was something behind the bricks," Walter continued. "I mentioned it to your dad once. He just laughed, said the house had secrets. Thought he was joking." Walter's eyes met Sarah's. "But I never believed Danny ran off. Kids don't run without shoes. Not in Pennsylvania. Not in June." Sarah swallowed hard. "The furnace room is still sealed." "I know. Walter reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of newspaper, yellowed and brittle with age. He laid it on the table carefully. Found this a few years back when I was cleaning out my attic. Thought about burning it. Thought about a lot of things. But I kept it, just in case. Sarah unfolded the paper. It was a short article from the Chester County Times, dated June 18, 1997. The headline read, "Local boy still missing, search continues." But Walter had circled something else in red ink. A small paragraph near the bottom of the article that Sarah had never seen before. In possibly related news, local maintenance contractor Thomas Hartley, age 54, has been reported missing by his family. Hartley was last seen on June 13th, 2 days after the Morrison boys' disappearance. Police say they are investigating possible connections between the two cases. Sarah's heart dropped into her stomach. "I don't remember this." "Most people don't," Walter said quietly. "The papers only ran it once. Then the story disappeared, just like Thomas Hartley did." "Who was he?" "Maintenance man. Worked on a lot of the old houses in the county, including yours." Walter leaned forward. "He was here 3 days before Danny went missing. Your dad hired him to look at the furnace. Something about unusual noises coming from a basement." The room seemed to tilt slightly. Sarah gripped the edge of the table. "My dad never mentioned that." "Your dad didn't like to worry people," Walter said gently. "But Thomas, he was spooked by something. I ran into him at the hardware store the day after he'd been to your house. He said the furnace room felt wrong. Said it was breathing. There was that word again, breathing. And then he disappeared," Sarah whispered. Walter nodded. 2 days after Danny. Never found a trace of him." They sat in silence for a long moment. Finally, Walter stood and put his cap back on. "You should have someone look at that wall, Sarah. Someone who knows what they're doing." Sarah looked up at him. "Will you help me?" Walter studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Yeah, I will. But Sarah..." He paused at the door. "Whatever's behind that wall, it's been there a long time. Be ready for what you might find." After Walter left, Sarah sat alone in the kitchen. The newspaper article spread before her. She read the name again and again. Thomas Hartley. A man she'd never met, never even heard of, whose disappearance had been swallowed by the larger tragedy of her brother's vanishing. 2 people. 1 week. 1 house. That couldn't be a coincidence. Sarah stood and walked to her father's old study, a small room off the hallway that her mother had kept exactly as it had been when he died. His desk was still covered in papers and bills and handwritten notes in his careful script. His reading glasses still sat on top of a folded newspaper from 2009. Sarah opened the desk drawers one by one, not sure what she was looking for, but knowing she needed to find something, anything, that might explain what had happened in this house. In the bottom drawer, beneath a stack of old tax returns, she found it. A thick manila folder labeled simply, Property Morrison Farm. Inside were utility bills, insurance documents, and repair receipts going back decades. But tucked in the very back, folded carefully and clearly handled many times, was a hand-drawn diagram. The basement. Dated 1974. Sarah spread the paper out on the desk, her hands shaking slightly. The diagram showed the layout of the basement exactly as it was, the furnace room marked clearly in the southeast corner. But there was something else, something drawn in faded red ink. A narrow rectangle extending behind the furnace room wall. And beside it, in her father's handwriting, storage tunnel, sealed 1926. Sarah stared at the diagram, her mind racing. A storage tunnel. Behind the furnace room. Sealed nearly a century ago. He's still there. Behind the furnace. Her breath came faster now. Her father had known. He'd known there was something behind that wall, had known it was sealed, had known it was there. But he'd never opened it. Never mentioned it. Never investigated it. Why? Sarah looked closer at the diagram. In the corner, so faint she almost missed it, were 3 letters written in pencil. Th. Thomas Hartley. Sarah's hands began to shake. Thomas Hartley had drawn this diagram, had been here, had seen this, had known about the tunnel behind the furnace room. And then he'd disappeared. Sarah folded the diagram carefully and headed for the basement. But before we find out what Sarah discovered down there, I need to tell you about something else. Something that happened the night Danny Morrison disappeared. Something the police never knew, because no one in the Morrison family ever told them. You see, Danny had tried to tell them something in the days before he vanished. Had tried to explain what he'd been hearing in the basement, what had been calling to him from behind the furnace room door. But no one had listened. And that silence, that decision not to believe a frightened 8-year-old boy, would haunt the Morrison family for the next 28 years. The basement felt different in the afternoon light filtering weakly through the small windows near the ceiling. Less threatening, perhaps, but no less strange. Sarah stood at the bottom of the stairs, the diagram clutched in her hand, staring at the furnace room door. The chain was old, brittle with rust. The lock that held it closed looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. But Sarah had come prepared. She'd found a toolbox in her father's workshop, had selected a hammer and a crowbar, had convinced herself that she could do this. She had to do this. The first strike of the crowbar against the lock sent a sharp metallic ring through the basement. Sarah winced at the sound, glanced toward the stairs as if expecting her mother to come running. But the house remained silent. She struck again, and again. The lock held firm, but the screws holding the chain's mounting bracket to the doorframe were old, embedded in wood that had been weakened by decades of moisture. On the fourth strike, one of the screws popped free. On the sixth, another. 10 minutes later, the chain fell away with a clatter that echoed through the basement like a gunshot. Sarah stood there, breathing hard, staring at the door. She reached out with a trembling hand and touched the handle. It was warm. Warmer than it should be. The furnace wasn't running. The basement was cold. But this door, this wood, it radiated heat like something alive. She turned the handle and pulled. The door didn't budge. Swollen shut, just like the police reports had said. Sarah wedged the crowbar into the gap between the door and the frame and pulled. Wood groaned. The frame splintered slightly. She pulled harder. And then, with a sound like a gasp, like something releasing breath it had been holding for years, the door swung open. Warm air rushed out, not hot, but body temperature, carrying with it a smell that made Sarah's stomach turn. Not decay, not death, but something sweet and cloying, like flowers left too long in a vase, like fruit rotting in summer heat. Sarah stepped back, her hand over her nose and mouth, waiting for the smell to dissipate. Slowly, it faded, replaced by something else. Something that smelled like dust and stone and earth. She grabbed her flashlight and stepped into the furnace room. The space was small, maybe 10 feet by 12, dominated by the old furnace that crouched in the center like some sleeping metal beast. Pipes climbed the walls like veins, disappearing into the ceiling. The floor was concrete, cracked and stained. Cobwebs hung in the corners, thick and undisturbed. And there, at the back of the room, just as her father's diagram had shown, was the wall. It looked different from the others. The bricks were older, darker, the mortar between them uneven and crumbling. Sarah moved closer, running the beam of her flashlight across the surface. And then she saw them. Scratches. Dozens of them. Thin lines carved into the mortar, into the bricks themselves, as if someone had clawed at the wall with desperate fingers. Sarah's breath caught. She moved closer, her light revealing more details. Some of the scratches formed letters. Crude, uneven, but unmistakable. D-A-N. Sarah's vision blurred. She reached out with shaking fingers and traced the letters. Her little brother's name, carved into this wall in the darkness, in the silence, in the years before he disappeared. But no, that wasn't right. These scratches were old, worn smooth by time. They couldn't be from 1997. They were older, much older. Sarah ran her light along the wall, finding more letters. An E, 8J, an M, a whole alphabet scattered across the bricks like some desperate code. And then, in the bottom corner, almost hidden in the shadow where the wall met the floor, she found initials carved deep into the mortar. T.H. Thomas Hartley. Sarah stumbled backward, her heart hammering. Thomas Hartley had been here. had carved his initials into this wall. But when? Before he disappeared? After? She forced herself to breathe, to think. She examined the wall more carefully, running her hands across the surface. And there, about 3 feet from the floor, she found it. A section of the wall that sounded different when she tapped it. Hollow. Sarah's hands were shaking as she picked up the crowbar again. She wedged it into a crack in the mortar and pulled. The old mortar crumbled easily, dust falling like snow. She worked the crowbar deeper, prying at the brick. And then, with a sudden crack, the brick came loose. Warm air rushed through the gap, stronger this time, almost forceful. Sarah dropped the crowbar and shone her light into the hole. Darkness. Deep and absolute. But not empty. Sarah could see something in there, beyond the brick, beyond the wall. A space. A tunnel. And on the floor of that tunnel, barely visible in the beam of her flashlight, was something that made her blood run cold. A shoe. Small. Child-sized. Red with white laces. Danny's shoe. The one he'd been wearing the day he disappeared. Sarah didn't remember climbing the stairs. Didn't remember leaving the basement or closing the door behind her. The next thing she knew, she was sitting on the floor of the upstairs hallway, her back against the wall, her phone in her hand, trying to remember how to breathe. Her mother found her there 20 minutes later. Sarah? Her voice was soft, frightened. Sarah, what's wrong? Sarah looked up at her mother, at this woman who'd carried 28 years of grief in silence, who'd locked herself in this house with ghosts and memories and questions that had no answers. I found something, Sarah whispered. Behind the furnace. Her mother's face went very pale. She sank down onto the floor beside Sarah, her movements slow and careful, as if she were very old or very fragile. What did you find? A tunnel. Behind the wall. And Danny's shoe. Her mother closed her eyes. I was afraid of that. Sarah stared at her. You knew. I suspected. Her mother's voice was barely audible. Your father told me once, years before Danny was born, that when he bought this house, the inspector mentioned something about the property's history. That it had been something else before. Something that burned down in the 20s. They built our house on the foundation. What was it? Sarah asked. Her mother opened her eyes, and in them Sarah saw something she'd never seen before. Not just grief. Terror. A children's home, her mother whispered, for troubled youth. Run by a man named Elias Grant. It operated from 1892 until 1926, when it burned. There were rumors about that place. About children who went in and never came out. About tunnels beneath the building where Grant would. She couldn't finish. Sarah felt sick. Mom, how long have you known this? I found out after Danny disappeared. I went to the county records office, searched through old newspapers, old documents. I thought if I could understand the house, I could understand what happened to my son. Her voice broke. I found articles about the fire, about how the building collapsed, about how they sealed the basement afterward because it was structurally unsound. And I found a list. A list. Her mother nodded, tears streaming down her face now, of children who died in the fire, children whose bodies were never found. She looked at Sarah. One of them was named Daniel. Another was Thomas. The same names. The hallway seemed to tilt. Sarah gripped the floor to steady herself. You think. I think this house remembers, her mother said. I think whatever happened down there in 1926, whatever darkness lived in that place, it didn't die with the fire. It just waited. And every so often it takes someone. Someone with the same name. Someone who reminds it of what it lost. Sarah shook her head. That's impossible. Is it? Her mother grabbed Sarah's hand. Then explain the shoe. Explain Thomas Hartley. Explain the letters on the wall. Explain how a door that's been sealed for 70 years suddenly has fresh fingerprints on it. Sarah had no answer. They sat in silence for a long time. Finally, Sarah spoke. We need to open it. We need to see what's down there. No. Her mother's voice was sharp, frightened. Sarah, no. Whatever's down there, it's been sealed for a reason. If we open it. If we don't, we'll never know what happened to Danny. We'll never know the truth." "Some truths aren't meant to be known," her mother whispered. But Sarah was already standing. "I'm going back down there. With or without you." Her mother stared up at her. And for a moment Sarah thought she would refuse, would beg Sarah not to go, would lock the basement door and throw away the key. But then something shifted in her mother's expression. Something hard and resolved and desperate. "Then I'm coming with you," she said. Together, they descended into the basement. The furnace room door stood open, exactly as Sarah had left it. The gap in the wall gaped like a wound. Darkness beyond it absolute and waiting. Sarah had brought more tools, a larger flashlight, and a length of rope she'd found in the garage. But her mother had brought something else. A journal. Old leather-bound. The pages yellowed and brittle. "What is that?" Sarah asked. "I found it years ago," her mother said. "In the attic. Hidden under the floorboards. I think it belonged to Elias Grant." Sarah stared at the journal, then at her mother. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" "Because I was afraid. Afraid of what it might mean. Afraid of what people would think." Her mother held out the journal. "But if we're going to do this, you should read it first. You should know what we're walking into." Sarah took the journal with trembling hands. The leather was cracked and worn, the binding loose. She opened it carefully. The handwriting inside was small, precise, almost obsessive. The first entry was dated March 15th, 1892. "Have established the Grant home for wayward children on the Morrison property. 12 beds, a kitchen, a schoolroom, and below, the memory room. They said I was mad for building it, but they don't understand. Memory is sacred. Memory is eternal, and I will preserve it no matter the cost." Sarah flipped ahead, her eyes scanning the entries. They grew darker with each page. The children forget so quickly. Forget their names, their families, their pasts. But in the memory room, they remember. They remember everything. Forever. Further still. Young Daniel refuses to speak his name. But the room remembers it for him. The room knows. The room keeps. And then near the end, an entry that made Sarah's blood run cold. "The fire has taken the building, but not what matters. I have sealed the memory room. Let them think it collapsed. Let them think it's gone. But memory cannot burn. Memory cannot die. And when the time is right, when the names return, the room will remember. The room will call. The room will keep." The final entry was dated January 14th, 1926. "I am old now, dying, but my work will continue. The room will wait, and when it hears its names again, it will wake. It will whisper, and it will take back what it remembers." Sarah closed the journal, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped it. "He was insane," she whispered. "Or he knew something we don't," her mother said softly. They stood at the gap in the wall, staring into the darkness beyond. Sarah tied one end of the rope around her waist and handed the other end to her mother. "If I call for you, pull me back. No matter what. Promise me." Her mother nodded, her face pale. "I promise." Sarah took a breath, clicked on her flashlight, and crawled through the gap in the wall. The tunnel beyond was narrow, barely wide enough for her to move through on hands and knees. The walls were stone, ancient and rough, covered in something that felt like moss or lichen. The air was warm, far warmer than it should be, and it moved around her with a rhythm that was almost like breathing. Sarah crawled forward, the rope trailing behind her, her flashlight beam cutting through absolute darkness. The tunnel curved slightly, descending deeper beneath the house. And then, after what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 feet, it opened up. Sarah emerged into a chamber. It was small, no more than 12 feet across, with a low ceiling of rough stone. But the walls were covered in names. Hundreds of them, carved into the stone in letters of all sizes, all styles, all ages. Daniel, Thomas, Sarah, Michael, Emma, Jacob, Margaret, William. On and on, layer upon layer, names carved over other names until the stone was barely visible beneath them. Sarah's light swept across the chamber, revealing more. A wooden shelf sagging against one wall. And on that shelf, objects. So many objects. A child's shoe. A doll with no face. A toy soldier. A book with no title. A necklace. A pair of glasses. A baseball glove. And there, at the end of the shelf, a red Superman t-shirt folded carefully, as if someone had just taken it off and set it down. Danny's shirt. Sarah's vision blurred. She crawled forward, reaching for the shirt with shaking hands. The fabric was warm. Not room temperature. Warm. As if someone had just been wearing it. And then she heard it. A voice. Soft. Familiar. Coming from somewhere deeper in the chamber, from shadows her light couldn't quite reach. Sarah. She froze. Her heart stopped. The voice was young. 8 years old. Unchanged by time. Danny, she whispered. I've been waiting, the voice said. I knew you'd come. The room said you would. The room remembers. Sarah's hands clenched around the shirt. Danny, where are you? I'm here. I've always been here. The room keeps me. It keeps all of us. All of you. Movement in the shadows. Not one figure. Many. Small shapes, child-sized, emerging from darkness like memories taking form. Sarah's light swept across them, and she saw faces. Pale. Young. Wearing clothes from different eras. 1920s, 1950s, 1970s, 1990s. And there at the front, a boy in blue jeans with brown hair and blue eyes and a gap-toothed smile. Danny. He looked exactly as he had the day he disappeared. Not a day older. Not a single change. The room preserves us, Danny said softly. It remembers us exactly as we were. Forever. Sarah couldn't breathe. Danny, I need to get you out of here. Danny shook his head. We can't leave. We tried. But the room won't let us. It keeps what it remembers. Then we'll make it forget, Sarah said desperately. You can't make it forget, another voice said. Older. Adult. A man stepped forward from the shadows. In his 50s, wearing work clothes. His face lined with weariness. I tried. For 28 years, I've tried. Sarah stared. Thomas Hartley. He nodded. I came here to help. Thought I could save the Morrison boy. But the room took me too. Took me the moment I carved my initials into that wall. He looked at Sarah with infinite sadness. It's taken everyone who's ever tried to remember what it keeps. Sarah's rope grew taut behind her, her mother pulling, calling her name from beyond the wall. But Sarah couldn't move, couldn't leave, not without Danny. There has to be a way, she said. Danny stepped closer. In the flashlight beam, she could see through him slightly, as if he were becoming transparent, as if memory were the only thing holding him together. There is one way, he said quietly. But you won't like it. Tell me. The room keeps what it remembers. But if you give it something new to remember, something stronger, it might let the old memories go. Danny's translucent hand reached toward her. It needs a memory. A real one. A living one. Sarah understood. The trade. The terrible, impossible trade that Elias Grant had built this place to make. Memory for memory. Life for life. No, she whispered. Sarah. Her mother's voice, desperate now. The rope pulled harder. Danny's form flickered. I don't want you to, he said. I never did. But the room is hungry. It's always hungry. And it's been calling you since the day I disappeared. It put your name on the wall. It's been waiting for you. Sarah looked around the chamber, at the names covering every surface, at the pale forms of children who'd been taken across 100 years, at Thomas Hartley, who'd tried to save one boy and lost everything. And she made a decision. I won't trade myself, she said firmly. And I won't let the room have you. But I'll give it something else. She pulled Elias Grant's journal from her jacket, where she'd tucked it before crawling through the wall. The leather was warm in her hands, pulsing slightly, as if it were alive. This, Sarah said, this is Grant's memory, his obsession, his madness. Everything he wanted this place to be is written in here. Every thought, every dark intention, every terrible thing he did. She held it up. You want memory? Take his. Take all of it, and let these children go. The chamber grew very still. The breathing that had filled the air stopped. The warmth became cold. And then, from everywhere and nowhere, a voice. Old. Vast. Hungry. His memory for theirs? Yes, Sarah said. One for many. Fair trade. Silence. Long and terrible. Then, acceptable. The journal was ripped from Sarah's hands by invisible force. It flew to the center of the chamber and hung there, suspended in air, its pages flipping wildly. Light poured from it, not natural light, but something else, something that burned without heat, that illuminated without warmth. And the children began to fade, not disappearing, releasing. Their forms grew brighter, more solid, more real, even as they became less visible. Sarah saw Danny smile, saw him mouth the words thank you, saw him reach toward her one last time. And then they were gone. All of them. The chamber was empty, silent. The names on the walls crumbling to dust. The objects on the shelf dissolving like smoke. And the journal burning now with real fire, consuming itself in seconds until nothing remained but ash. Sarah felt the rope pull tight around her waist. She turned and crawled back through the tunnel, back toward the gap in the wall, back toward her mother's voice calling her name. When she emerged into the furnace room, her mother caught her, held her, pulled her away from the wall. They stumbled backward together just as the wall itself began to crack, to crumble, to fall inward. The tunnel collapsed with a sound like thunder, like the earth itself sighing in relief. Dust filled the air. The furnace room shook. And then, slowly, everything grew still. Sarah and her mother sat on the basement floor, holding each other, covered in dust and cobwebs, and the residue of 100 years of darkness. And the house, for the first time in a century, was silent. Truly silent. The breathing had stopped. 3 months later, Sarah stood in the farmhouse kitchen, supervising the contractors who were renovating the basement. The furnace room had been completely rebuilt, the old wall removed. The space opened up and modernized. There was no trace of the tunnel now, no evidence of what had been there. Just clean brick and fresh mortar and new pipes that didn't breathe. Her mother had decided to sell the house. Too many memories, she said. Too much history. She was moving to Oregon to be near Jessica, to start over somewhere the past couldn't find her. But before she left, she'd done something Sarah never expected. She'd had Danny's room renovated too, painted it fresh white, put in new carpet, turned it into a guest room that looked toward the future instead of the past. And on the wall, where his school photo used to hang, she'd placed something else. A small brass plaque, in memory of Daniel Morrison and all the children who were lost. May they finally rest. Sarah touched the plaque gently. She thought about the journal, about Elias Grant's obsession with preserving memory, about how that obsession had twisted into something dark and terrible. Memory was important. Remembering was sacred. But so was letting go. Walter Bennett had helped with the renovation, had been there the day they'd opened up the basement completely. He'd found something in the rubble of the collapsed tunnel. A small metal box, dented and rusted, but still sealed. Inside were photographs. Dozens of them. Children from different eras, posing stiffly for the camera. Their names written on the backs in Elias Grant's precise handwriting. Sarah had taken those photographs to the County Historical Society. Let them be remembered properly, she'd said. Let their families know what happened, even if it was a century too late. The Historical Society had been grateful. They'd even written an article about the Grant Home for Wayward Children, about its dark history, about the fire that had consumed it. They didn't mention the tunnel, didn't mention the memory room. Some truths, Sarah had decided, were better left buried. But not all of them. Sarah had written her own account of what happened, had put it in a sealed envelope with instructions that it not be opened for 50 years. She'd given it to Walter, made him promise to keep it safe. Why 50 years, he'd asked. Because by then, anyone who might be hurt by the truth will be gone. But the truth itself should survive, should be remembered, even if it's terrible. Walter had understood, had taken the envelope and locked it in a safe, where it would wait for half a century before being opened. Now, standing in the kitchen of her childhood home for the last time, Sarah felt something she hadn't felt in 28 years. Peace. not happiness, not the absence of grief, but peace. The quiet acceptance that some questions have no good answers, that some losses can't be recovered, that some memories have to be released before they consume you. She thought about Danny, about the boy he'd been, not the ghost he'd become, about his laugh and his energy and the way he used to hum songs with no words. She would remember that Danny, would hold on to those memories. But the rest, the darkness and the fear and the terrible weight of not knowing, she would let go. She had to, because memory was meant to preserve life, not replace it. And Danny's life, short as it had been, deserved to be remembered for the joy it contained, not the tragedy it ended with. Sarah locked the farmhouse door one final time and got into her car. In the rearview mirror, she watched the house grow smaller, saw it fade into the distance until it was just another old building on a quiet road in rural Pennsylvania. A house that had once held terrible secrets, but now held only silence. And maybe, Sarah thought, as she drove away, maybe that was enough. Maybe silence was its own kind of peace. If this story has stayed with you, if it's made you think about the weight of memory and the cost of holding on to the past, then do me a favor. Subscribe to Ultimate Crime Stories. Because there are more tales like this one waiting to be told. More mysteries buried in old houses and forgotten places. More truths that deserve to see light, even when they're difficult to bear. Some stories aren't meant to stay buried forever. This channel is dedicated to bringing them back, to remembering, to honoring the lost, and to making sure that even the darkest truths eventually find their way home. Subscribe to Ultimate Crime Stories, because the past is never really gone. It's just waiting to be remembered.